want to welcome everybody this morning. For today's lecture, Brotherhood welcomes former speaker Dr. Jonathan Gruber. He's going to be discussing his book today, Jumpstarting America. He will review the history of how public spending on science made America great, how it is necessary to keep doing it so, and how it can revitalize spending in a way which broadly benefits all parts of the country. He is a Ford Professor of Economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he has taught since 1992. He is also the Director of Healthcare Program at the National Bureau of Economic Research and the former president of the American Society of Health Economics. He has published more than 175 articles, and from 2003 to 2006, he was the key architect of the Massachusetts ambitious health reform effort, and in 2006 became an inaugural member of the Health Connector Board, the main implementing body of that effort. During 2009 to 2010, he served as a technical consultant to the Obama administration and worked with both the administration and Congress to help craft the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, and has many more accomplishments to his name. So with that said, let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Jonathan Gruber.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks everyone for having me on a Sunday morning. I appreciate your getting up and making the time. The book when I'm talking about today, and I think if it's okay, I'll talk for about a half hour and then take questions afterwards. Is a book I've written. It's been out. It came out about a year and a half ago. A book with Simon Johnson, who's my colleague at MIT, called Jumpstarting America. And to sort of motivate thinking about this, I think it's useful to think about sort of a signal event from a couple years ago, you may remember, which was the Amazon HQ2 competition. You remember Amazon announced they were going to set up a second headquarters somewhere in North America. And they said 6 weeks later, they wanted cities to basically lay out why they'd be a good location for their Amazon HQ2. And 230 cities responded aggressively within 6 weeks. It's pretty striking because at the time, it may be hard to remember now, but at the time, a few years ago, the economy was running very hot. Unemployment was low, historically low, things were going great. And the question is, why did so many places want this Amazon HQ2? As we thought about it, we realized there are really fundamentally two reasons. The first reason is that the economy was not running as hot as it seemed. Yes, unemployment was low. Yes, the stock market was high, but fundamental economic growth was slow. Economic growth has been, over the past several decades, very, very slow. And that's been reflected in a slow growth in the standard of living for the typical American. Median household income hadn't really gone up for decades. Second of all, we noticed that the growth that was happening was disproportionately concentrated in a few set of what we call superstar cities, like Boston. A few set of cities on the coast, think Boston, New York, DC, San Francisco, LA, Seattle, where all the innovation jobs were centered, where all the exciting growth was happening, but the rest of the country was getting left behind. And we started wondering sort of why was that? What's going on? And we realized that, when you think about what causes growth is economic innovation, new ideas, new products, new inventions. And what causes innovation is research and development. And we noticed a startling fact, which is that in the mid-1960s, the U.S. government spent 2% of our entire GDP, one in every $50 in America, went to government-sponsored science. Today, it's less than 0.6% of GDP. And we've gone from being by far the world leader to 12th in the world in terms of public R&D spending. And we realized, well, maybe what's gone on, maybe the reason the U.S. is growing slowly is because we're not investing in science like we used to. So we set out to write a book to understand what's going on in the U.S. and to talk about some solutions. So really the book has sort of three parts, and I'll go through them briefly today, but I hope you read the book and get more details. The first part's sort of the history. How did America become great at doing science and what went wrong? The second part is the economics, why public R&D really matters. And the third part is the policy, what should we do about it? So the first part of the book, the history, really begins in the spring of 1940, when Vannevar Bush, a very famous scientist, former dean at MIT, headed the Carnegie Foundation at that point, got a one-on-one audience with FDR and said, look, this war is not going well for the Allies. Germany had just swept through Europe with unprecedented new technologies. Meanwhile, the US in the year of 1939 had produced 6 tanks, could not figure out how to make a torpedo that would explode on impact, and had soldiers practicing with broomsticks instead of guns. And Vannevar Bush went to the president and said, I think the way to win this war is new technologies. And FDR said, sure, I'll write you whatever check you want. And off Vannevar Bush went and set up really the greatest innovation infrastructure the world's ever seen, and really the technology that won us World War II. And coming out of that, FDR asked Vannevar Bush to write a report, a famous report that became Science, the Endless Frontier, which inspired the idea that we should continue to invest in science in the post-war decades. And we continued to. We spent more and more on science, and we ended up, as I said, by the mid-1960s, we were spending 2% of our entire GDP on public R&D. Every modern invention, every modern technology has its basis in that public financing push. From satellites to modern jet airplanes to digital computing. Indeed, let's talk about the most famous name in computing, at least historically, which is IBM. IBM was a mid-sized, sort of moderately successful company until the Air Force decided in the 1950s it wanted to develop a better missile defense system. So they contracted with IBM. They basically paid IBM to do the R&D and contracted to buy what IBM produced. At one point, the government was paying more than 50% of the R&D costs of all major computer companies in America. IBM contracted with then a fairly not well-known company called the Rand Corporation to write the biggest piece of code ever written, a 1,000,000-line piece of code to do this. And the result of that was fundamental developments in coding and in systems. But here's the thing, those developments didn't just benefit the military. IBM then built on that to build the computer system that became the basis for how all airlines run their booking systems. And that was part of how IBM became a very successful company. And there's story after story of technologies that came out of this military investment that went on and became the benchmarks of our economy. Remember, one of the fundamental innovations in World War II was the invention of radar. What was the first microwave called? It was the radar range, because microwaves were invented out of the technology that was used to develop the radar, and so on and so on. Every major technology that we use today has its basis in that. At the same time, the US economy was booming because the government invested in inventing these new products and also invested in training a generation of scientists who could develop these products through something called the National Defense Education Act, 1958 piece of legislation, which basically was a massive investment in the training and funding of science students. It paid for all the microscopes that were in elementary schools. It paid for, at one point by the 1980s, the US government paid for 90% of all PhDs in computer science. Basically, government increased the demand for skills by paying for new technologies to be developed, and government increased the supply of skills by paying for new scientists to be trained. The result was the creation of the greatest middle class the world has ever seen. Millions of high-paying jobs create technologies that we sold all around the world. So what went wrong? What went wrong was really 3 things. The first was sort of the hubris of scientists, which was signed. It's maybe hard to believe now, but in 1960, the Time magazine Man of the Year was the scientist. Okay, scientists were viewed as superstars, and they got a little full of themselves, doing things like saying, well, don't worry about nuclear waste. We're going to have free energy in America, and nuclear power is safe. And suddenly, their predictions started to prove to be wrong, and people got a little upset about that. The second was that scientists and politicians started disagreeing. Scientists and politicians started disagreeing. And as we say, when you speak truth to power, power cuts your funding. And when scientists didn't support what, say, politicians want to do in the Vietnam War, they started cutting their funding and disagreeing to the point where finally Richard Nixon fired his science advisor because he wouldn't agree with Nixon's military plans. And then finally, the third thing was the U.S. entered a budget squeeze because of the Vietnam War, because of the growth of the social welfare state with Medicare and Medicaid. We had less money to spend on science, and science got squeezed out. So the increase in R&D funding was a bipartisan process. It rose up under both Democrats and Republicans, and it then fell under both Democrats and Republicans to the point where by under President Trump, and it's not Trump, it's continuous since the mid-1960s, R&D bottomed out at less than 0.6% of GDP, public R&D spending. Now, the question is, you have to ask yourself, we have a lot of, I'm sure, private business people on this call. They're saying, well, why do I care? Private companies do the research and development that drive America. Private companies do the research and development to create new products. Why do I need the government? And the answer is that there are two fundamental problems facing private research and development when it comes to creating the breakthrough technologies that create massive growth. The first is that private companies do research to benefit their bottom line, but not research that spills over to benefit the economy in general. In other words, they want to do they want to do R&D to help them develop new products, but not the R&D that really generally is going to innovate and might, if anything, even help their competitors. Now, in the book, all the economic section of the book cites ad nauseum, and like a quarter of the book is footnotes. They're at the end, so you can ignore them if you want. But it cites ad nauseum, tons of economic research studies, but it's more fun to talk about the stories. So let's talk about a story here. Let's talk about what happened when two drug companies, Merck in the US and Sankyo in Japan, were racing in the early 1980s to develop a statin. Statins are cholesterol-lowering drugs that are miracle drugs now. They save about 200,000 lives a year are saved by the availability of cheap generic statins. Well, these were being developed in the early 1980s. And then suddenly Sankyo shut down their trials. And Merck found out that Sankyo shut down the trials because some animals had gotten sick. So Merck went to Sankyo and said, wow, what happened? And Sankyo said, we're not going to tell you. You're our competitor. And Merck said, well, let's collaborate. Well, whatever. And Sankyo said, no, we're just shutting down our trials. So Merck, afraid that this drug was dangerous, shut down their trials too. 5 years later, some academics got some funding from the FDA to revisit these trials. And what they found was what wrong with the animals in Japan had nothing to do with flaws in the drugs. It was something else. These drugs were actually totally safe. And that led to the development of statins. But 5 years too late. Statins saved 200,000 lives a year. That's 1 million people who died because companies could not benefit from the spillovers of the research done by other companies. When research is done by one company, it spills over to others. But the first companies can't capture that. And as a result, they do too little R&D. This problem is getting worse over time. For example, some of the leading research in all of science used to be done by corporate scientists. Corporate scientists published some of the most important research articles. They won Nobel Prizes. But published research by corporate scientists has fallen by 60% in recent decades because companies don't want their scientists publishing research anymore. They want them just doing research for their own company. So basically, these spillovers are not happening. The private R&D is not generating the broad knowledge that leads to development of new sectors. So that's one problem. The second problem is the failure of financing new technological ventures. Now here you might say, well, wait a second. We have the most successful venture capital sector the world's ever seen. And we do. The venture capital sector in America is incredibly successful. More than a quarter of the stock market value today is companies that initially got VC funding. But the VC sector suffers from a fundamental problem when it comes to financing new breakthrough technologies in capital-intensive areas, which is, let's talk about how venture capital works. How venture capital works is venture capitalists, what they want to do is they want to take very risky bets that will reveal themselves fairly quickly as to whether they're successful or not. So what venture capitalists do is they have a bunch of money they raise from limited partners. They raise a fund for limited partners, and that fund will have a life typically of 10 years. But it's not that the new startups have 10 years to show their success. Within about 3 or 4 years, the venture capitalist has to decide who to double down on. So if a company is not really shown that it's going to deliver within 3 or 4 years, venture capitalists will cut bait. Okay? Now, it's not always true. I'm sure we have some VCs on the phone and they can disagree with me on the call. But bottom line is they want quick turnaround. This is a model which is perfectly designed for software and information technology. A model where you can put a little bit of money in an idea, not a lot to you and I, but a little bit to a venture capitalist, $5, $10 million, and see pretty quickly if it's working or not. It's not a model that works well for capital-intensive new ventures like in clean energy or biotechnology. As a result, the VC dollars we have been very focused our particular sector has done incredibly well. Like I said, it's won 25% of the stock market, but not focused on other sectors, which really suffer from this problem we call the valley of death. This problem that basically there's not the money out there to support capital-intensive long-term investments. And once again, a story illustrates this well. The story I'll tell this time is about a company called Boston Power here in Boston that had done really innovative work in lithium-ion batteries, a critical technology for ultimately fighting climate change and more sustainable energy. They were doing really well. They had customers ranging from Hewlett-Packard to Saab, but they wanted to expand. And to expand, they wanted to build a new plant. So they proposed to build a new plant in Auburn, Massachusetts, a community that could use the jobs. It would have been 500 new jobs at their new plant, but it would have been $100 million. And they couldn't raise the money. Venture capitalists said that, look, the $100 million is too much. That plant's going to take years to build. We don't know if it's going to pay off. And they couldn't raise the money. Well, they couldn't raise the money from U.S. venture capitalists. They did raise it from Chinese venture capitalists, because Chinese venture capitalists backed by the Chinese government were willing to make that investment. There was just a small condition, which is they had to move the plant to China, not to Auburn, Massachusetts. So now Boston Power, a successful company, has hundreds of jobs, thousands of jobs in China that could have been in the U.S. And the story happens over and over again. So we've got this problem of essentially private sector R&D, which is successful, but which is not leading forward in these new important technology areas, particularly ones that are capital intensive and take a long time to reveal themselves. Now, that doesn't say the government can do better. Okay, just because the private sector is getting it right doesn't mean the government can do better. And so the question is, what's the evidence the government can do better? I mean, there's this historical evidence, and that was great. But why do we think public R&D investments can do better? And the answer, I think, is right now could not be more in our face than it is right now. Because everything we're doing right now goes back to the Human Genome Project. Let's talk about what happened. In the early 1980s, a Nobel Prize-winning biologist named Walter Gilbert, who'd won the Nobel for showing how to sequence DNA and had already started a successful startup called Biogen, decided that the future lay in mapping the human genome and actually mapping the genetic sequence of the entire human set of DNA. This project was going to take decades, and it was going to ultimately result in this public map, but he thought this was a really worthwhile venture. So he tried to raise $10 million, which even there in 1980s is not much. And no one gave him the money. They said, why should we fund this? It's not going to result in any profits for us. It's going to be decades down the road. We're not interested. So he gave up. Fortunately, he and some other colleagues were able to convince Congress to fund the Human Genome Project, a $3 billion, 13-year investment in mapping the human genome. The Human Genome Project was so successful that today, the genomics-based jobs in America, there's 270,000 genomics-based jobs in America, paying an average wage of $70,000 each. And this sector, in 1 year alone, pays $6 billion in taxes, twice our 13-year investment in the sector. Okay. Moreover, the vaccines that exist today would not exist without the Human Genome Project. Literally, it was the basis for the miracles we're seeing scientifically today. Okay, it was government-funded science. Indeed, if you look at the NIH in particular, the returns to funding in government-funded bio research has been outstanding. And here's the key thing. Government funding of R&D doesn't displace private R&D. It complements it. For every $1 NIH spends, there's $8 of corresponding private pharma R&D that follows along. So NIH has been incredibly successful. Every $1 of NIH investment yields $3 in stock market return. NIH has been incredibly productive in translating basic research into goods and products we need. But it's not just NIH. Let's talk about everyone's favorite whipping horse, at least those of us who were around in the 80s, the Department of Defense. We all remember the stories of $435 hammers and $20, plastic covers for outlets. Everybody's whipping boy is defense procurement. But Department of Defense R&D has been a fundamental driver in innovation in our economy. Let's talk about another modern story. There was a small company in Cambridge that had a contract from the government to develop innovative minesweeping technology. They developed this really cool mobile minesweeping technology. And they said, wait a second, this is a pretty cool technology. We could maybe use this for other things. We could even maybe make a vacuum out of this. iRobot developed the Roomba. iRobot now employs more than 1,000 people making primarily Roombas off an initial government contract. In story after story, government R&D funding pays off. And it's not just government investments in the science, it's also government addressing the hole in our venture capital system. Government programs like the Small Business Innovation Research Program, government loans have shown to be incredibly productive in helping startups get started. And actually VCs often follow those government investments saying, well, that seems like good investment. The government invested in it. So the government has a fundamental leadership role to play. But there is an enormous problem that both the private sector and the public sector suffer from, which is an excessive concentration of research and development in a few places. 75% of venture capital is spent in only 5 cities in America. Over the last 15 years, 90% of all jobs in what's called the innovation sectors have been created in 5 cities. 90% of the nationwide jobs have been created in 5 cities. Okay? Basically, what's happened is we have become an economy that is very focused around a fancy word. Now here I'm going to give you if you remember nothing else today, I'm going to give you a little cheat code. This is how economists get rich and famous, is we make up fancy sounding words for really easy sounding concepts. So this is an illustration of what we call agglomeration, which sounds like a really fancy word. All agglomeration means is smart people want to live with smart people. That there's basically there's benefits from all getting together and learning together. So the knowledge economy has created massive agglomeration so that basically people want to live in a technology hub. We gave talks on this book to probably 20 different universities, mostly on the coast, but a lot off the coast too. Okay. Every time I'd ask the students, how many of you would like to get a job someplace other than Boston, New York, DC, Seattle, San Francisco, and LA? We never had a group of students where more than 15% said yes. That's 6 cities. And 85% of the students everywhere we talk wanted to go work in them. Okay? Now, in theory, that is not necessarily a problem. In theory, agglomeration economies are good. You put the smart people together and they produce even more stuff, and that's great. The problem is the cities aren't playing along. And they're not playing along because they're not allowing for development of affordable housing. And basically what's happened is these cities have grown in terms of the jobs and skills, but they haven't grown commensurately in terms of the amount of people that can live there. So as a result, in 1980, if you look at the 10 highest earning cities in America, first of all, only in the 10 highest earning cities in America, only 2 were on the coast. They're mostly inland and in the middle of America. And the average house price in the 10 highest earning cities in America was 25% higher than the average house price in every other city. Today, of the 10 highest earning cities, 9 are on the coast. And the average house price in those 10 cities is 3 times higher than the average city in America. Okay, basically the problem is the jobs are all in these cities, but people can't afford to move there and do those jobs. And that's the crisis we're facing. But here's the key point. We can have technology hubs other places. Technology hubs are not preordained to be in these 6 cities. Okay, let's remember the story of how Seattle became a technology hub. Okay, remember when Bill Gates started Microsoft, where did he start it? In Albuquerque, New Mexico. Bill Gates dropped out of college and with his friend, he went to Albuquerque, New Mexico. Why? Because it was a great place to start a new company. They had a national lab, Sandia National Lab, and it was way better than Seattle. The murder rate was half as high. Seattle was a dump. They even had a sign at the airport in Seattle saying, with the last one out of Seattle, please turn off the lights. Okay, it was a dump. And so naturally, he didn't go there. He went to Albuquerque and started Microsoft there. But, he'd been born in Seattle and he really wanted to go home. So he brought Microsoft home and started Seattle as his new technology hub. Fast forward to 1994, a guy named Jeff Bezos gets in his car in New York to drive west to start a new technology company. Does he go to his home city of Albuquerque? No, he goes to Seattle. So things that turned out differently, Walter White could have been cooking meth in Seattle, and Albuquerque could be the technology hub of America. Places aren't preordained to be technology hubs. What do they need? They need 3 things. They need a reasonably population. You need people around to do this. They need an educated population with good universities. And to start, they need to be an affordable place to live. So my co-author and I did is we went to the data. We said, how many places in America have at least 25% of the population college educated, have at least 100,000 working age population, so it's a big city, and have an average house price below $220,000, which is like monthly rent in Boston, right? Okay, but it's actually the median house price in America. Okay, we found 102 cities, from Rochester, New York, to Columbus, Ohio, to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, to Atlanta, to Houston, to Tucson, Arizona. Okay, places all over the country where there are excellent universities, well-educated populations, and you can afford to live there. And we said, why can't these places be the next technology hubs in America? And that led us to our proposal. And so before the proposal, I'm going to give you a little quiz. Don't feel bad if you get this wrong. I've now given this quiz either live or virtually to about 2,350 people, I think, of which 14 have gotten it right. So don't feel bad if you get this wrong. Okay, don't shout out the answer, but if you got it right, and you be honest, you can put in the chat if you got it right, and I can change my statistics. And if you read the book, no fair, because it's in the book. So what city in America is the home, the worldwide, and certainly the US home of the computer simulation industry, as well as the largest university by enrollment in the country? Home of the computer simulation industry, as well as the largest university by enrollment in the country. Now, I'm guessing at least most of you and probably none of you guessed Orlando, Florida. Okay, why Orlando, Florida? Well, what happened in Orlando, Florida? Orlando, Florida, in 1956, the editor of the Orlando Sentinel endorsed a little-known politician named Lyndon Johnson for president. He endorsed him again in 1960, and then 64 held a big parade for LBJ. So after the 64 election, LBJ said to this guy, look, you've been really good to me. What do you want for Orlando? And the guy said, I want a Navy base. Now, did Lyndon Johnson let the fact Orlando's landlocked stop him from putting a Navy base there? No, he's Lyndon Johnson. He put a Navy base there. They've even got a cement ship out front. Okay? So what do you do at a landlocked Navy base? You train people. So it became the training hub for the Navy, including there was a small, on Long Island at the time, there's a small what's called a battle simulation unit that they moved down there. Now, fast forward to 1978. 1978, there's a mediocre mid-sized university called University of Central Florida that is in Orlando. It's 45 minutes from Disney. This is very east. This is nothing to do with Disney. This is very far east of Disney. And the president, very innovative president, noticed that land was super cheap because interest rates were high. So he went to the Navy and said, look, I want to build a research park right below my university. And I want to build it around this new, you've got this unit that's doing this early computer modeling of battle. I think we could do a lot of stuff with that. Why don't you move that off the Navy base below the university, and we'll build a research park around it? And the Navy agreed. Today, the Central Florida Research Park has 10,000 employees. And East Orange County, 45 minutes from Disney, has added 100,000 jobs in 30 years based on this government investment, mostly private sector jobs. Okay? So this is the kind of success we can make. But there's a bit of a depressing coda to the story, which is I talked to the manager of the Central Florida Research Park. I said, this is an amazing story. He said, well, there's one problem. The problem is that companies start here. They work hand in hand with the university. By the way, University of Central Florida, which is the answer to the largest enrollment in the country, sometimes it's number two, it's either one or two, is now the 10th best electrical engineering school in the country. Okay, out of nowhere, out of nothing. Okay, it's an incredible story. And they said the research park is great. There's terrific synergies between the university and the research park. He said the problem is once the companies start to grow, they leave. They go to Seattle, Boston, New York, San Francisco. He said the reason is because the education in Florida isn't very good. The education system isn't very good. And we're 45th in the country in venture capital. There's no money here to invest in new startups. So what Simon and I realized is we really need a plan. If we wanted to make this work, we need a plan with really three pieces. The first piece, and this is our proposal, was a massive investment in public R&D. We proposed $100 billion a year, or 0.5% of GDP, which would take the US still only to well below, it would take us to about 1.1% of GDP, still well below where we were in our peak. Move us from 12th in the world to the top 3 in the world in public R&D. But second, we propose that not just be done the way we do R&D traditionally, which is it just goes to the same elite places that get it now, but rather that at least part of that be spread around the country through what we call a jump-starting competition, through creating new technology hubs, but by putting massive resources into places so they can at the same time improve their education systems, their infrastructure, attract venture capital, jumpstart their way to becoming new technology hubs. And a place like Rochester, New York, okay? Rochester, New York, terrific university. If you've met people from Rochester, they really love it. Every talk we give, someone from Rochester is like, yeah, I love Rochester. I wish I could live there. There's just no jobs. People want to move back there. They've got a great university. Average house price is $170,000. It's a terrific standard of living. And my wife's from Minneapolis. It reminds me very much of Minneapolis 25, 30 years ago. Okay, it's a great place to live. It just hasn't caught on. And what better place to do research on optics and photonics than Rochester, New York, the home of Kodak and Xerox and Bausch and Lomb, which is a really important growth area. Have them set up a technology hub in that and fund them to improve their educational system, their infrastructure, et cetera. Now, the problem, of course, with that is that how do you avoid this becoming a boondoggle? How do you avoid just, the most powerful politicians just getting the money to their districts? And so here, we propose to follow a model that worked successfully in the past. You'll remember from House of Cards season 1, the guy would testify in front of the Base Closing Commission. The Base Closing Commission was something set up by the military as an objective way to, in a nonpartisan way, close military bases, which is hard to do politically. And it's been very successful. We've closed hundreds of military bases using this nonpartisan sort of objective mechanism. We propose a tech hub opening competition where nonpartisan government entity would have cities compete to become new tech hubs. But instead of competing the way Amazon did, which is saying who can give me the biggest tax break, they compete by showing that they meet the preconditions for being a new tech hub, that they have a sustainable development plan, that they can grow inclusively, they have excellent universities, that they can have a strategy for integrating the universities with their business community, etc. So that's the second part of our plan. The third part of our plan is to figure out ways to make sure we redistribute the returns to this to all Americans. It's been great what Amazon's done, but it's just made Jeff Bezos super rich and he pays no taxes. We need to really have a system which makes sure the returns to these investments get returned to all Americans. So that's our plan. The bad news is the rest of the world already figured out this plan. So basically, if you look at the last chapter in our book is a story of multiple technologies that were developed with U.S. government funding that started in the U.S., that then couldn't grow because they couldn't get the private sector funding, that then went to other countries and have become transformative. Let's talk about synthetic biology, one of the potentially most important sectors in the world over the next several decades. Synthetic biology is basically replicating biological processes in the lab. So the most successful early example was the treatment for malaria came from the Chinese sweet wormwood tree, which was very hard to get. They basically created synthetic malaria treatment out of replicating the genetic processes of this tree. It's been a miracle. And basically, it's a field invented at MIT in the Boston area with NSF funding. And the NSF funded this area. They even set up an international competition called iGEMS, where people compete on projects in synthetic biology. Well, the NSF, after 10 years, the initial funding for this ran out. And so the NSF hired the Sloan Foundation, a very prominent science foundation, to do a report on should they continue to fund this. The Sloan Foundation came back and said, this is an unbelievably productive activity. You shouldn't just continue, you should double down. But the NSF killed it. The NSF was in a budget crunch, and they said, no, we're not going to fund this anymore. So the US research leadership in synthetic biology faded. Meanwhile, it's become a major topic of focus in Asian nations. So much so that the most recent iGEMS competition, China won most of the events, and the US no longer does. Okay, it's just it's a trivial thing, but it's just a way to illustrate that we're losing our leadership in topic after topic. We need to do this. That's the bad news. The good news is the American politicians seem to be listening. There's now 3 different bills in Congress, which I've had the pleasure of getting to work with politicians on a number of them, that are based on these ideas. Most significantly, the Endless Frontiers Act, Chuck Schumer's, which is a bill. It's a bill sponsored by Chuck Schumer, but it's a bipartisan, bicameral bill. House and Senate, Republican and Democrat, has sponsored a bill to spend $100 billion in R&D over the next 5 years, as well as $10 billion in these kind of jump-starting grants to create new technology hubs. Representative Ro Khanna from San Francisco has done an even more ambitious bill, more along the lines of our book, more like $1 trillion over 10 years in this investment. And Joe Biden actually proposed in his Build Back Better plan is going to propose $300 billion. At least that was in his campaign plan. It will come up with in the end $300 billion of new R&D financing over the next 4 years. And actually, I was pleased cited our book as motivation for spending that money. So politicians need to be listening. That said, it's a long way from listening to legislation. So my hope is from a talk like this that folks get excited about this topic, and the extent you have contacts and links that folks will continue to help to push ideas, because I think if America really wants to grow and lead the world, we need to invest in science. And so let me stop there. I've gone on long enough, and let me see what questions folks have about this.
Your comment, you mentioned the 5 cities that are most popular for this kind of, what you said, Boston, DC, New York. What were the other 2, I think?
It was 6. It's really Boston, DC, 6. New York on the East Coast, then LA, San Francisco, and Seattle. LA's sort of coming up. LA's on its way, but really Seattle, San Francisco on the West Coast.
I mean, obviously, those are nice, large cities with very robust educational institutions in them. How do you actually, get to cut to the chase, my daughter has an amazing, wonderful job in a very high-tech pharmaceutical company located in Lafayette, Indiana.
Yeah.
An hour north of Indianapolis and 2 hours from Chicago. The quality of life in Lafayette is significantly lacking. You have places, you mentioned places like Rochester, beautiful little city, but compared to the quality of life in terms of culture and activities, it can't possibly compete with the likes of Boston and Los Angeles and those places. So no matter how well you subsidize the environment there, you're still competing for the culture and the lifestyle as well. And I'm just curious how you would compete for those aspects of it.
It's a great question, Dan. And I think that that is why we think this is either go big or go home. Throwing $100 million in Rochester to build a new, center for whatever isn't going to do anything. But if you said to businesses and venture capitalists, the U.S. government is committing on the order of we suggesting order of $2 billion over the next decade to a city like Rochester that will be developed, and your airport's going to become world class. We're going to remediate all these greenfield lands to have cheap place to build plants. We're going to create a new technology hub. Meanwhile, the average house price is $170,000. Even if it goes up, it's $200,000. This can change. You're right. It is sort of we can't outrule agglomeration, although there's this question of what COVID does to agglomeration. I don't know the answer to that. I don't think it's going to change as much as other people do, but you can't repeal the laws of agglomeration, but you can create new places where agglomeration happens. And I think this is not a proposal to redistribute to poor rural places. This is not a proposal that saves those places. This is about places that are the next tier of cities that have the potential to jump up. And some places have naturally, your Austin, Denver, these are places that are on their trajectory to that next tier. But most places need help getting over that. We call it the agglomeration hurdle. And we think you can do this. If we're wrong, we've still created a bunch of jobs in these places. Maybe they'll never compete with Boston, but there's so many talented people just can't afford to live in Boston right now. And Boston just doesn't seem interested in making itself affordable. It's just not where it's going. The other solution is, look, I don't know how often you guys have gone down the Charles and gone down the Chicago River. Okay, you go to the Chicago River, it's a ton of incredibly tall skyscrapers. The Charles, it's 3-story brownstones. Mm-hmm. Okay, maybe Boston will finally be willing to build the skyscrapers we should, and then maybe Boston can become a place that can grow more. But given our existing housing rules, people just can't afford to live here. And so they want to come to Boston, but where the hell is she going to live?
There's definitely that conflict between affordability and the benefits that come with living in a very expensive and well-funded environment. The concert halls, the museums, all of those are sort of connected to each other. And, there's certainly not a reason why a Rochester couldn't develop those kinds of things. But I think we are starting to cluster around those already established cities. And breaking that trend, I think, is going to be a little tough.
Okay. Dr. Gruber, we do have a couple of questions in the chat. I just want to make sure I get to those.
Yep.
John Clayman, thank you for speaking today. The pandemic has driven many professionals to flee New York, San Francisco, Boston, etc. Can you comment on this? Will this drive more R&D centers into the center of the U.S.? Thank you, John, for the question.
Yeah, great question. And look, we don't know. I mean, this book, COVID has both promoted the ideas in this book, but it's also sort of made them potentially harder. It's promoted them because they're really seeing the need for more R&D in this time of crisis. But in one level, it's raised the question, do we need to spread it around anymore? Will this break the fever that has been agglomeration in these 5 or 6 cities? Will this finally be a straw that breaks the camel's back? Or will it not? I mean, what's interesting is, you see where are these VC guys, where are these tech guys going from Silicon Valley? They're going to Miami. Well, Miami is also unbelievably expensive to live in. Miami isn't that much, doesn't really solve our problems. There's not a lot of place to live in Miami. It's better weather, but it's still, the average house prices are very high. I do not think life's going to change that much. I think that, my guess is people will be willing to live farther from the cities. So people will, I think this is a boon for house prices in Sudbury and Acton and places like that, because people who before felt like they had to live in Wellesley and Newton will be now I'm only commuting a day a week and live, another half hour out. But I don't know what's going to mean people are going to leave Boston.
How do we combat the anti-science and anti-intellectual feelings that have grown in recent years?
One way we combat it is by spreading the science. So we did a fun project as part of this book. There's something called the General Social Survey where people report their attitudes towards science. And if you look at people who live in the technology hubs, they are much more likely to support government funding of science. And they're much more likely to believe in education as a tool of economic growth. People who live outside these technology hubs. So partly we just have to expose people to the benefits of science. If you're in the outside technology, you think science is something that just benefits other people. You appreciate the cool stuff it's made, but you don't think it creates jobs. And that in some sense is the number one lesson of our book, which is that if Vannevar Bush made one fundamental mistake, and that fundamental mistake was not explaining how good science leads to good jobs, the economic benefits of investing in science. And basically that's the real argument, honestly, for spreading the science around the country is a political argument, which is that if you try to say we want tons of new R&D and you don't spread it around, it's going to get turned down in Congress. People are like, we're tired of these elite places getting all the money. So you have to spread the wealth so that the rest of the world sees the benefits, and then you'll grow appreciation for science.
In the early 1960s, when Kennedy spoke about putting a man on the moon by the end of the decade, it created all kinds of excitement and so large amounts of money was spent on the space race. Many people went into science. What can we do to create something like that again? The question is it green energy? Is green energy going to get people excited as the space race was?
It's a great question. You could break that question further because you look at the 2 big booms in investment in science. It was first fighting Hitler and then getting to the moon. 2 very transparently important objectives that can motivate people. We don't have that now. What we do have is 2 motivators which are neither as compelling on their face, but which could be made compelling. The first is international competition, that basically we are losing out to these other countries in fundamental ways. I think people are starting to really see the economic threat from China. Not threat like they're going to attack us, but threat like basically we're not the world leader anymore. So it's sort of external competition. The other is internal. Our country's being ripped apart. And our country's being ripped apart partly through lots of reasons like racism and other things, but partly through economics. Partly through the fact that basically most America is not seeing the benefits of these jobs. And so I think there's an internal threat to not investing in spreading the wealth in our country, not just rich to poor, but geographically. Okay? And I think those two things can motivate the kind of strategy we lay out. I'm not 100% sure they can, but I'm pleased that at least Congress and the president seems to be taking it seriously.
I don't know how we became anti-intellectual, and by that I mean particularly Trump's base, which isn't going away. I don't know how this occurred, but the same way that there's all this excitement about sports and entertainment, what do we have to do to make scientists seem someone that are interesting to the public? Yes, the great majority of the public, they probably couldn't name a scientist other than Einstein.
Yeah, I don't know that we need to create superstar scientists. I don't think that's key. I think the key is, once again, jobs. The manager of Central Florida Research Park told me that for every PhD scientist, they needed 10 lab techs. Mm-hmm. The lab techs are the key. The lab techs don't need to have PhDs. They don't even need college degrees. Okay. And basically that's the key, is basically not to make scientists famous, but to make people understand that we are creating growth and opportunity through these investments.
Mm-hmm. Doug, I actually, to piggyback on that, Dr. Gruber. So where do we stand and compare to other countries in terms of, say, lab techs, and, how do we fare against the other countries with this kind of, the industry?
Not well. Yeah. But basically, once again, this huge geographic distribution, inequality. In some cities, we're training very well-educated people, and other cities we're not. And the problem is it's perpetuating. So if you look at new inventors, they are increasingly coming from the same place as old inventors. More and more of invention infrastructure is being separated into just these few places. And so basically we need, I talk a lot about Rochester because that was a great example in our book, and they love us in Rochester. We even started a group called Jumpstarting Rochester, and they love our ideas up there. So we visited Rochester a couple of times, talked to them. And the problem is their education system is awful. I mean, their local education system is like one of the worst in the country. They've got this terrible inner city education problem. So you can't jumpstart a place like Rochester unless you can have a better education system that can train people. Now, what's the barrier? It's largely political and old racism and other things. The question is, can money solve that? Can you really say to Rochester, look, if you can get your educational house in order, you can get hundreds of millions of dollars. Can you do it? Is that enough to sort of get them to actually fix what's wrong with their educational system? I don't know. But the idea of the competition, if it's not, fine, the money goes elsewhere. I mean, we're not talking about 100 cities. We're talking about, in our book, we're talking about 20 to 30 cities. So the idea is, which are the cities all around the country that can really show that they can meet the standards to create those lab techs and other things?
In 1987, there was a group of biotech companies that created a training class to take someone and get them ready to go into biotech. And my wife, Diane, she was going to stop becoming a medical technologist and go into biotech. She quickly discovered that most of the jobs were low-paying jobs unless you had a PhD, and she stayed as a medical technologist. So
but remember, low-paying to your wife is high-paying to the guy who otherwise is going to be working at the auto body shop or something like that. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're not creating. Look, we need to create $70,000 a year jobs. We don't need to create 200,000. I mean, we need more $200,000 a year jobs too. But the main thing is we have a whole lost generation of people who are smart. They don't want to get PhDs, and they're happy to make $70,000 and live in Lafayette or wherever. And that's who we need to help out.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for coming today to visit us. My concern with technology companies today, and I think technology is great, I'm not anti-technology, is I see Twitter shutting down people. I see Parler being closed out by the server companies. I see the MyPillow guy being kicked out of real people like Bed Bath & Beyond and Kohl's because they didn't like who he supported. There seems to be a big thing with cancel culture. I see they took Dianne Feinstein's name off of a school in San Francisco. They don't like Lincoln. They don't like George Washington. So people who see these kind of trends may be very hesitant to approve their representatives in Congress giving more money to the technology people and the technology corporations, with a sense of what are they going to do to us next after we fund them and they create the next great thing? How are they going to block me or my cousins or my friends? So that's my commentary.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, there's two separate issues here, which is, the free speech issues, which we don't really have time to get into now. But let's talk about technology issues.
I think they tie together a little bit, though.
Well, I mean, and they do. But look, I want to make two reactions to yours. So one is there's two different reasons not to like technology companies right now. One is we don't like the power they have. We don't like these private companies having such power over our systems. Well, the way to deal with that is to create competitors for them. And the way to create competitors is to invest in science so that new competitors can emerge. Right now, the problem is, we have this problem of these tech companies earn outsized profits. They use those profits to invest in R&D for their private needs, and they just grow bigger and bigger. We need the government to invest in social R&D that can create competitor technologies that can take these guys down. That's the way you do it. So,
unfortunately, it's a nice idea, but I look at somebody like Parler, who is an alternative to Twitter and who is a competitor. And I understand they had to go to Russia to get new server services because they couldn't get them from Amazon anymore. They were blocked. So, and the government doesn't step in. I mean, let's be honest, these congressmen and senators are getting tremendous funding. They're getting jobs after they leave office. They wouldn't even pass that bill to hold people like Facebook and Twitter liable in legal cases if they're using themselves as editors rather than just publishers. So I know, and many times myself, I don't look to the government to solve any of these problems. So I'm just giving you an outside opinion on why somebody could be hesitant to fund a lot of government money to technology, and it's because of their behavior.
Well, I think, I think that you and I could have a much longer discussion. I think we might disagree about a number of things. But I think that the bottom line is science investment creates jobs. And ultimately, we are breaking apart as a society because there are not jobs. The middle class is disappearing. And we have to address that. And the way we address that is investing in technology. We need that separate from addressing larger technology in society. And let me I think you are not raising the most important issue. I think the issue you're raising is a fun issue to talk about, but it's not the most important. The most important issue is that these companies are the most profitable companies in our country and they don't pay taxes. That is the most important issue. Okay.
Well, that's an important issue. I won't disagree with you. I don't think it's everything.
And what it is and basically, I do not support investing, creating new big technology companies that are not. We need a way to make sure the returns of these investments come back to the American people. I think that's really important.
Like, aren't you asking those of us in Boston to support exporting our high-paying jobs to other American cities and simultaneously decimate the value of our homes?
When I discussed this idea with Joe Kennedy back when he was your congressman, he was not as excited about this idea as I was. But no, I'm not asking that because my proposal is more to Boston and more to the rest of the country. So my proposal is, the proposal we have in the book is $100 billion a year, of which Boston will get a huge share, just not all of it. I mean, basically, we want more R&D in all the tech hubs and around the country. That's our point. But here's the political economy view we have, which if you just say more R&D money that goes to the same places, it won't pass Congress. That basically, by spreading some of that money, you can actually get more money from Boston. So we think it's a win-win. By spreading, you make it politically feasible to get a boost in R&D funding, some which is naturally going to come back to Boston. So we think this is a win for Boston as well as the rest of the country.
From, looks like Ralph and Arlene, thank you for the informative presentation. Looking towards the future, it seems that the greatest field of growth should be in the area of green energy. However, the majority of the spending in this country by government is generated towards defense. What might you suggest would enable a bipartisan push away from defense to growing green energy, which should, in my opinion, generate tremendous growth?
I think it's really interesting. First of all, fun fact, defense is not the major part of our spending. Of course, defense is tiny compared to Medicare, Medicaid, and the other social insurance. So right now, remember, as Paul Krugman said, the U.S. is now a pension fund that happens to have a small army. Okay, the U.S. government is not. We're not really. So defense is still big. It's and it's still hundreds of billions a year. And I think, first of all, defense there's a vital role to play in the defense infrastructure and moving towards green energy. But I think in general, addressing climate change is a classic example of where the private sector falls down, where basically private companies make more money relying on the existing fossil fuel system, and where venture capitalists don't want to invest in large capital-intensive long-run projects. So it's a prime spot where government R&D is needed, and it can create jobs. But the thing is, my belief is we need to stop talking about as green energy is good because we want to save Bangladesh. And we just start talking about as green energy is good because it makes good jobs. And that we need to really focus on that aspect of it. I think Biden's doing that.
Thank you again, Dr. Gruber. So couple more questions and that's it.
Someone sent one to me, Bill.
Okay, go ahead.
Gruber, Amy asks, what is Israel doing in this area which makes it so successful? And can the U.S. follow that model?
That's a great question. Israel has been very successful. Now, Israel's successful for a number of reasons. One is excellent education, which is always first and foremost here. But the other is an incredibly strong government presence in financing startups. Israel is famous around the world for having a government-run fund that is providing the financing that startups need, which we don't do. We rely on the private venture capital sector. So I think Israel is exactly an example of that we should follow here in the U.S.
Thank you very much. It's been fantastic. We really appreciate all that you've shared with us this morning. I hope everybody else has felt the same as I do. Again, appreciate your time, your energy, and what you've shared with us. Please join us on March 21st as our guest speaker will be Dr. Charles Steinberg, president of the Worcester Red Sox. And as always, continue to look for information given by the Brotherhood on the Temple website. Again, Dr. Gruber, thank you very much for your time. It's a pleasure. And I want to give that's John. Thank you. Good idea. Everybody give him a round of applause because with our group, it's always a challenge working with all of us, but there were great questions. So again, thank you for your time this morning.